Welcome. My name is Bill White, professor of art at Hollins University, and I have been asked by some of my students to do what is known as the last lecture. You may have seen these on YouTube or other sources. Apparently it's a common practice at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and they thought this might be an interesting way to have a kind of farewell and remembrance of me as I retire this May 2010. I guess the things that I'd like to share with you all and talk about for this presentation has really to do with creating a life in art. From my own personal experiences and how things in my life, in and out of the studio, in and out of the classroom, in life in general, have helped to shape me and make me the person I am, which therefore has an influence on the artist I am and the teacher I am as well. I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was part of that first wave of baby boomers born in 1945, and lived in a neighborhood that was largely a mixture of European immigrants from World War II and folks who were, like my own family, part of the working class. My dad had been a house painter and had his own business. My mom was, for my early years, a stay-at-home mom, and my parents married later in life. And so I would say, given my conversations with my mother over her lifetime, that having children was one of her greatest prides. And she certainly was devoted to my brothers and myself. As I grew up, I had some losses, family members who passed away, and I think that really began to shape my early experiences about sort of the fragility of life. When I was about 3, my older brother, Tommy, passed away tragically from the results of some surgery that didn't go well as he was having his tonsils removed. And he was 5, I was 3, and we were very close at the time. And I remember my mom saying, that I would ask such questions as, well, when is Tommy coming back? As I grew older and had an interest in art, primarily, eager to do those kinds of things that I think many of you have been engaged in from your childhoods as well, to draw, to paint, to be curious about how art looks and why it looks the way it looks. And I was very fortunate that my mom, being both an older parent and somebody who was very curious about the world, read a lot, was eager to take me, when I would ask, to places like the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So in my early experiences, I had both encouragement and the opportunities to experience great art firsthand. As I sort of explored art, thought about the things that I was interested in, it really never occurred to me that I would be an artist for my life. It was something that I didn't know anybody who was an artist. Basically, the people I knew were plumbers, electricians, factory workers, like my dad, a house painter. My mom later became a bookkeeper. And so these experiences, I think, early in life, when you're kind of unaware, you're not yet really conscious of all the things that do impinge on who you become, I was very fortunate that these experiences were so positive. My dad died very suddenly when I was about 9. And by then I'd had a younger brother, David, who was 6 years younger than myself. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, had come to live with us. And she had recently been displaced from her job. She had been a weaver at a mill in Philadelphia that moved south, as was a common practice back in those days in the 50s, to relocate industry into the South for the sake of not having union workers. And so I was raised effectively for my life after the age of 9 by 2 very strong and independent women. Again, this never seemed to be something I was particularly aware of or focused on as what it might do to me or for me. But as you'll see, I think as I go on, the influences have been very significant. My grandmother, who was then the sort of stay-at-home mom as my mother went out to work, was a very simple person, not much education, formal education, and in her later years became fairly religious. And so I recall at times her saying to me, as a way of helping me understand the mistakes I was making and choices and actions in my childhood, she would say, "Now, Billy, God did not make you perfect, so don't be afraid of making a mistake. However," and then she wagged her finger at me, and she said, "but I don't want to see you keep making the same mistakes over and over." You know, as a kid, that really didn't register as being something particularly significant, but I think over my years, especially in art school, and then subsequently in my life, that idea that one should not fear experimentation, trying things, exploring, asking good questions, being curious, and likely failing in the sense of not having immediate success at the first thing you try. By the time I got to art school at the Philadelphia College of Art, started in 1963, I, again, was very fortunate to have a number of very excellent teachers. And I had, I would say, excellent teachers throughout my 4 years in undergraduate art school. What I hadn't really particularly thought about, coming from a family with a mother and a grandmother who raised me, was that, in fact, I had a fairly large number of women teachers who were excellent artists themselves and quite significant in my growth and development as an artist. One experience I had as a freshman, and I think some of you will appreciate my revealing this, is that I didn't really think about how much of an affront my comment was to make. Had a teacher for drawing. She also taught me printmaking, Claire Van Vliet, who was an extraordinarily good artist. She is still. She has gone on to receive a MacArthur Foundation grant and has founded the Janus Press in Vermont, which is a producer of artist prints, but especially artists' books. So Claire Van Vliet was criticizing our class, not just me, but our class in general as first-year students in drawing, about the fact that we weren't really understanding the fact that space is three-dimensional, and that in a drawing you want to be able to express somehow that sense that it's not just the outline flatly on the page, but in fact that space evolves, moves across and around boundaries, disappears, reemerges somewhere else. So I think in an act of frustration, she brought in one day, at her own expense, little spools of wire, not unlike the things that you might see in a florist shop. She handed them out to everybody, and she said, okay, today we're going to draw our model, and the model is going to be drawn using wire. Well, my hand went up and said something to the effect, well, that sounds like sculpture, and this is a drawing class. How come we're being asked to make sculptures and not learn drawing? Well, as you can imagine, it didn't go over real well, but yet at the same time, she didn't take such offense as to toss me out of the class. But I went on to realize from that experience especially that if you don't understand something in one way, being able to shift your mode, your kind of attention to another one can be very, very helpful in revealing something that has remained at that point sort of opaque to us, impenetrable. I would say subsequently, to my pleasure, I've had contact with Claire Van Vliet, subsequently wrote her a letter of apology after about 40 years, and have a good friendship now with her. Another teacher I want to tell you a little bit about is Edna Andrade, who was my color teacher as a sophomore. And Edna was a particularly interesting and sort of stunningly beautiful woman with great character and carriage. I remember thinking as I saw her sometimes before I had her in class, who is this person? She just seems to have such presence, sort of charisma, as we might say today. So that when she walked through the hallways into a room, it's like people sort of noticed her. And Edna was an extremely sensitive and adept colorist. And I feel like I got a lot of my introduction to what the magic and capacity of color is by having had the chance to study with Edna. We did many kinds of things using color aid paper, and we learned the sort of Albers, making one color like two and two colors looking like one, reversing grounds, all of the various exercises that are kind of typical to a color course of that sort of Bauhausian in approach. When Edna retired in, I think it was about 1987 or 88, I went to her retirement celebration at PCA in Philadelphia and had a chance to talk with her. And one of the questions I asked her, I said, look, I've been now a teacher for a good number of years. You were my teacher. What were your concerns? What were you thinking about when you taught us in this class during 1965? And she thought for a minute, and without really skipping a beat, she said, I felt I wanted you to be able to survive me. And that took my breath away. I really didn't kind of get, I thought here was somebody who I had thought was very sincere and compassionate, certainly gave more than 100% to us all the time, as a teacher. But the idea that we had to survive her didn't make sense. So in asking her more about what she meant, she went on to describe the fact that certainly as an artist herself, trying to operate in a very competitive environment in both the world of painting, that point in the 50s and 60s for her, as well as being a woman in that time period, was really a sort of a negative in the sort of dog-eat-dog world. And she said, you know, really it's like the art world is so competitive. There's so many people who are out there trying to become recognized and acknowledged for their work, that you have to develop a very thick skin and learn to listen to what people might have to say to you. But at the same time, you have to stand by your work, believe in what you do, and try to become strong in that work. And that, she said, I felt like if I held my standards to the very highest possible, and you would attempt to meet them and could take strong and vigorous criticism of your work, and you could understand that and learn to take that in and make something of it, the chances are that you could be a survivor. And I do believe that in many ways, the environment that Edna spoke about, and I think felt herself as an artist, it remains today, I think, a very competitive environment. So how we each choose to navigate and find our path is, I think, like she said, is really about believing in what you do, doing it to the very best of your ability, and seeing where that will take you. I had a variety of teachers, mention a couple of others and then move on to some other things. Mitzi Melnikoff was an important teacher and friend of mine, and we have some of her work, gift from her family's estate, in the collection of the Wilson Museum, as well as we have a sample of some work of Edna Andrade's. And Mitzi was, again, a very interesting and curious kind of person to me. She was short, probably 5 feet tall, wore a very stylish outfit to class, but always wore pretty much every class time a different Mary Mako fabric smock. For many of you, that name of Mary Mako is not going to be familiar, but it's the kind of bold graphic work that you're seeing again reemerge today at places like Target and other sorts of stores, very bold graphic prints. So she was a very commanding person by her appearance. Short, with bushy dark hair but short cropped, thick glasses, and a very animated personality. And in her class, the course topic I remember because it had such an unusual topic. It was called People and Places. It was effectively a drawing class. And what she asked us to do was to not only draw in a traditional studio setting, but we'd often go out into the city and draw, learn how to capture sort of the mobility of people moving on the street. We'd go to a place called the Reading Terminal and the Reading Terminal Market, which is a large train station, kind of like a Grand Central Station is in New York. And especially the market, which was below ground, and today is quite an extraordinary place to go and get food and both prepared and fresh items. And so drawing people in the act of butchering, of setting up greens in their stand, how people moved, establishing the perspective of space, and how you begin to, as Claire Van Vliet was trying to introduce, how do you begin to suggest that things are not just simply flat shapes on the surface. And we had a great time. We went to the zoo, a variety of places, and her influence on me, I think, was more internal than actually practical about my work at that time. And she was one of the people, along with Larry Day and Sidney Goodman, who were very instrumental in my getting into graduate school at Tyler School of Art after I left undergraduate school. I want to mention Larry Day also to you. You may or may not know that we have a substantial collection of his life's work, a gift from his widow, Ruth Fine, who is a curator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and she was very generous with us in making a gift of Larry's work to the Wilson Museum. Larry was a person who I always was curious about because he had a kind of presence, as much intellectually, I would say, as practically, in terms of things that he taught, the things that he did as part of the energy and the environment of the Philadelphia College of Art at the time I was there in the middle 60s. And one of the things that I'm very grateful for in Larry and his relationship to my work and my development is his largely Socratic manner, which means that instead of answering a question I would pose, he would ask me a question in turn, trying to find out what I knew, what I understood, what I didn't know, and then would try to shape my exploration by the various questions he would pose, as well as then posing larger, very complicated kinds of questions that seemed to me fairly impenetrable at the time, you know, as a young student. One of those kinds of questions that he posed had to do with really the history of philosophy in Western tradition, and that is the contrast between sort of Platonic idealism and the 20th century aspect of philosophy in existentialism. And one of the things that I guess I hadn't really thought about until some of his provocative questions raised them for me is, where do we find the core of our values? Do we believe that there is such a thing as perfection? How can it be achieved by mere mortals? Echoing, in a way, my grandmother's sentiments. And how would one go about trying to bring that to artwork, to the process of the studio and exploration? Contrasting that is this idea of the existentialist's position, which is that the value that things have is the value we make, that it's our primary individual responsibility to create meaning, to create value, to have our lives be that kind of reflection of who and what we are, what we believe, that it's, in a sense, right on our sleeve. It's the presence of our values in every action that we are a part of. And so these questions were particularly troubling because they didn't seem to have any apparent simple answers. And they also seemed to me at the time to confound me because I wasn't sure how to connect these bigger conceptual concerns with my practical needs of how do I make a drawing of a figure in a space and make that have some kind of character. What if I painted in a certain way in terms of, say, a looser touch or more vivid color versus a more smoothed out kind of method of paint handling and with more somber, neutral colors. Well, what did that mean? And how did that reflect something much bigger than simply questions of technique? And these are the kinds of things that I felt were, especially in retrospect, really important elements of my own education as an artist and as a person. I was very fortunate that after graduate school to have, in fact, a life in the classroom as well as in my studio. And so I certainly had the desire to teach. I had been sort of encouraged to think in that way. I think partly because people had a belief in me that I wasn't sure was well-founded, but I hope it has been. When I went to graduate school, one of the things that was really, I think, a profound change for me was that I had come from 4 years in an environment where both my classmates and my teachers were really about developing me and always introducing some idea that was a sort of challenge to my abilities, but at the same time done in a way that I certainly didn't understand it at the time, but was probably more nurturing than strictly a kind of throwing down the gauntlet kind of challenge. When I got to graduate school, the first thing that I began to recognize was that the game was being played differently. And it sort of invokes this quality that Edna Andrade spoke of. That is, and I'll use the terms from economics and politics, which is to play a zero-sum game. Basically what that means is that you are a competitor with the other people, in this case in the class, and that there's only a pie or rewards so big, and that if I want to be the winner, that also means you have to be a loser. And that sense of competitiveness that was more about dog eat dog, I'm up, you're down, seemed to be suddenly the tone of what happened in graduate school. And that really kind of took me aback because I felt that I had not previously been learning that way. And it became a huge challenge to go into my studio at home and work in a way that then was going to be very aggressively challenged at every turn about everything when I would have to put it on view and have a critique. I survived the end of the first term review. At that time, you were brought into graduate school on what was called a provisional basis. You were accepted, you had to work then your first semester, and at the close of that semester, you had to put up a body of work in a large space, and all of the graduate students would, and all of the faculty at the Tyler School of Art, including people I had never even seen before in my life, from all media, would come and look at your work, ask you questions, challenge you in one way or another, and they'd go away, and you would find out a day or two later whether you survived that and would be continuing as a graduate student. And quite honestly, I was a bit surprised that I did survive that cut when several of my classmates, who I thought actually were doing better work than me, did not. I've come to understand subsequently that what I thought was better work in their case was actually that they had sort of, to the view of the faculty who were making these judgments, established a signature style and were in fact not exploring things in a very personally challenging way. And they saw that in what I did, and so I survived and they did not. In my second year in graduate school, there were some changes in the faculty in painting and drawing, and a young, fresh out of Yale Graduate School painter, John Moore, came, and John was a kind of realist, and he and I sort of hit it off, being closer in age and similar in interests in some ways. And I felt like I got a lot of positive feedback in this informal way from John. My major professor throughout graduate school, David Pease, who was the chair of the painting department, subsequently, after I left, had become the dean of the Tyler School of Art, and then on later, before his retirement, about 10 years ago, to be the dean at the Yale School of Art. David was a particularly meaningful mentor to me in graduate school, and introduced me to a range of other ideas outside of strictly sort of painting per se, one of which was the relatively new book at the time of Rudolf Arnheim's about art and visual perception, the psychology of the creative eye. And I'd always been kind of curious about how such things work, how we understand what we see and what we make of, interpret what we see, give it certain kinds of spatial interpretation, certain kinds of meanings by the way in which forms come together or sit on a page, meet the edge, stand in the center, and so on. And David suggested that I get this book, which was quite thick, and about 6 reproductions, and all the rest was text. It was a little bit daunting to try to work my way through it. But one of the things that was at the heart of this research by Arnheim is he asked a very basic question, and that was, we call artists people of vision. And we always talk about their unique vision. So he asked the question, do they in fact see in some way differently than the average person? So as a good scientist, as a psychologist, he went about sort of testing people of all walks of life, many different ages, to try to find out this kind of normative feature of visual experience. So his book was very revealing in that what it had done for me particularly was that it reinforced so many of the fundamental ideas that I had been introduced to in art school, which did not have, let's say, these kinds of verification, support, and underpinning from another discipline like a scientific approach in psychology as a gestaltist. And so it became this interesting sort of yin and yang kind of for me. It's like how much sort of the intuition and sort of experience of artists that had been communicated to me as part of the teaching method, pedagogy, was now being confirmed by these ideas developed from Gestalt psychology with Arnheim. And I found these ideas very compelling and feel like even to this day, my work is still largely informed by these kinds of ideas about the nature of perception and the experience of how one organizes an image as a form of visual communication. Also in my second year, I had another new teacher to the faculty at Tyler, Stephen Green, who was an important second generation abstract expressionist New York School painter of quite a substantial reputation in the art world in New York City, many important shows, work in major museum collections and so on. And I was assigned him as my graduate painting seminar mentor in this second year. And we met as a group, this class, and he said, okay, I don't know you, you don't know me. Best way for me to help find out is everybody bring in some work next week, and I just want to get a feel for what you do. So I brought in basically a little brown shopping bag full of about a half a dozen little Morandi-like still lives in oil, probably 8 by 10, 10 by 12, of little objects. Our daughter Heather was born at the time, and she was a toddler, and so little bottles of baby lotion, baby powder, and so on were some of the objects that I was painting in these simple little arrangements. So when it got time for me to put my work out, stood back and took a look, and he said, nobody's doing this anymore. This is not particularly meaningful, and I have nothing to say to you. So, unless you change, he said, you might as well not bother coming back. And which, of course, stunned me. But I thought, well, okay, this is what I want to do. So I decided I would just stay home and paint and not participate in the ongoing seminar. But obviously I had to get a grade, and so at the end of the semester, I showed him what I'd been doing, which included a number of large paintings, 5 by 6 foot paintings as well. And basically we just sort of had a standoff, agreed to disagree over the nature of what I was doing. And about a decade later, I was at a New York gallery opening, ran into Stephen, and I didn't have any particularly hard feelings, and wanted to say hello to him, and I went up to him and introduced myself and told him, I'm Bill White, I worked with you at Tyler and such in 1968, and wanted to say hi. And he stepped back and sort of took a look and said, oh yeah, I remember you. And he reached out his hand and shook my hand, and in doing so, he said, yeah, you were the only one who stood up for yourself. He said, I really appreciate the fact that you stood by what you believed in, regardless of what I had to say to you. And he said, that's, to me, a very important thing. He said, had you, in fact, capitulated and done something else that you thought I might like, I would have had very little or no respect for you. So he said, I think what you did was very important, and want to now tell you that. Again, another one of those startling experiences that came out of the blue. I would have not anticipated anything of the sort as a result of that. And it, again, has been one of those sort of important moments in my life when I realized that you just have to be who you are. You can't sort of try to be somebody different. It's not that you shouldn't explore and try things. I certainly have done that. And I've certainly been influenced greatly by artwork and ideas, people throughout my life. So I'm not saying that I take, sole credit for who I am and what I've become, what my work as an artist looks like either, but that by being a believer in yourself, working as diligently as possible, not giving up even when things are going badly, having a strong sense of work ethic and what your values are, I think is a very important thing. Certainly has helped me in my path. This also brings me to an idea which again I think comes out of psychology, which I think is a great sister discipline for the creative areas. Helps us to understand who we are in these more complex ways, along with, I think, disciplines like philosophy as well. And it's the idea that we learn things and have over our lifetime, an important acquisition of knowledge. So we have this realm, we might call it the cognitive, the fact that there are things that you know. I think the thing that has helped me beyond this, from both psychology and philosophy, is what's called the metacognitive, which is that it's not that you just simply know something, but that you're aware of being the knower, the person who is acting with agency and purpose on material to help in this way back with existential, to create meaning, to understand our lives in a larger context. So it's different, I think, from simply being thinking of ourselves as being sort of this briefcase full of facts and acquired knowledge that are just sort of like stuffed in there, one after another over a lifetime. For me, the importance of the metacognitive, also as a teacher, is that I think as my own experiences have led me to understand and to comprehend, always, of course, in retrospect, rarely at the moment, is that what you do, what I did and how I did it, in part shapes who I am and what I've become. And that by becoming more aware of what I know, what I don't know, how I engage the world, how I see the world in these larger terms, helps me to become a better problem solver. And I think I'll try to explain this feature in the following way. One of the things that Ed and Andrade criticized our class for, not only me, but the whole class, was she assigned problems, and they were challenging problems, pictorial problems, organizational problems of color and design. One day there was the wall full of her work for a critique, and she turned around and with real, I think, sadness in her voice, she said, "You all are just simply solution selectors." And she stopped, and we looked at her and we looked at each other, and really we were kind of dumbfounded. We didn't know what to make of that comment. And then she went on to say, really what we had done was not really understood the process that was necessary to be a good problem solver. And problem solving, I think, is not something that is a fixed method. It's not something that if you do it this time and you're successful, you have to do it that way every time. And I will cite this book called The Universal Traveler, book that I've had for a long time. And it talks about really the problem-solving process as a journey. First is to simply accept the situation. You have to be able to recognize and just simply accept the conditions of the problem that you're being confronted with. Then you try to analyze the nature of this accepted state of being. Try to define what the issues are in the problem and begin to conceptualize some of the ways in which you understand the elements that are interactive in this situation. Then to develop your ideas as to how you might address your understanding of these circumstances and conditions. Then you begin to select and determine the best ways you're going to try to go with this. And then, of course, there's the implementation aspect, which is how do you actually manifest these goals, these ideas, these ways of defining things. And then ultimately it's to evaluate. And one of the things that I guess I have discovered about myself in art in the studio is that the more I am open to accepting the situation, exploring it widely without determining what the best answer is going to be, which of course I don't know until I've explored it, and then exploring with relative freedom the possibilities that I think are there. I really haven't even begun this journey of problem solving. And this notion that at the end of those steps, one evaluates is important, but that is not, in fact, in my experience, the point of closure, because I see this journey as being a varied kind of, I'll call it feedback loop. That the process is you do these things, then you evaluate, and then you go back and you do the same kinds of things over again. You re-examine what you understand about the initial, what their problem is, as compared to the result you've made. And you begin to say, well, does this meet all of those challenges? Does it ignore some? Is this that way because I happen to like this more than that, but that's not relevant to what might be necessary and sufficient to be a good answer? So again, this notion of necessary and sufficient, where does that come from? It comes from my experience in philosophy, which is when you're looking at what something is, what its nature is, what its characteristics are, you ask the question, what is necessary for it to be such things as, in ontology, a person? Then what is sufficient, or what is sort of the minimum amount of whatever that is that's necessary in order to constitute personhood? So I'm speaking a little bit abstractly here, but I think it goes to this idea that you are, by necessity, needing to be an explorer. Always asking what-if questions, but then engaging in the process of work in a unencumbered kind of way, so that your own fears, your own anxieties, your own omissions of knowledge are not the things that are going to thwart you, primarily at the start. Because if you keep on this explorative kind of journey, each time you do something and you ask yourself to look at it critically and carefully in an unself-conscious kind of way, there are going to be things you learn from that which will, if used appropriately, help you in your subsequent activities to make it better, to make it different in some way, to make it stronger, to make it clearer, to make it more forceful. I think so much of what I have in some ways experienced in beginning level classes at Hollins is a student saying, but I'm a perfectionist. I can't do what you ask in that way because I'm a perfectionist. And that has always kind of dumbfounded me because it seems to me that, as my grandmother said when I was a child, we're not perfect. We can't be perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. Nothing is ever ideal in the sense of Platonic idealism. Nothing can be pure because we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with materiality in the world. We're making objects. We're doing things which have limitations to it. And so by saying, oh, I can't do something because I'm a perfectionist, is misunderstanding the nature of how we can develop better control, which I do believe in our work, in our understanding. How can we expand that capacity to do better? And again, that is part of an ongoing cycle. It's part of an unfolding process that I think is, as long as we live, never ending. Thank you very much for your attention.